Much like our video on what video card manufacturers think of mining, cryptocurrency mining, we're back now to talk about what some of the manufacturers we've spoken with think of the 1070 Ti. These are obviously anonymized answers and opinions from various people in the industry. Keeping it anonymous is one, a requirement for obvious reasons, but two, it allows people to speak their mind a bit more freely. After these thoughts and opinions, we'll go through some more of my own following the 1070 Ti review. Our review is really just focused on getting the numbers out there and getting through that phase. And now we can talk a bit more, expanding on the conclusion of the review and talking about the card's existence as a whole. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly, makers of the Conductonaut liquid metal that we recently used to drop 20 degrees off of our coffee lake temperatures. Thermal Grizzly also makes traditional thermal compounds for use on top of the IHS, like Cryonaut and Hydronaut pastes. Learn more at the link below. Let's start with the facts and what we know from the AIB partners, what they've told us. So this one is pretty widespread and recognized at this point. We've been talking about it for a few weeks now, but just to really confirm for everyone, there are no pre-overclocked 1070 Ti's under NVIDIA's dictation. So this is a rule that was put in place on the board partners. We've spoken with them. You could look at their product listings and confirm it yourself. They can't make a pre-overclocked model. They all ship at reference clocks. There's a way to cheat this rule and get around it, and that is to basically ship the card with an option to download and install software separate from the driver, and then use that software to apply a pre-configured overclocked state. It would be functionally equivalent to a pre-overclock, just you have to download and install more bloatware. This is definitely a suboptimal way of doing it, and the problem is the people who generally need a pre-overclock done for them rather than doing it manually are probably the same people who won't know that there is software, won't download it, or whatever. But that's one way to get around the rule of no pre-overclocks. They're able to ship software to do it. Another thing here, so speaking with the board partners, off the record, we were generally given the impression that the board partners definitely think that the 1070 Ti sales will be impacted by the lack of pre-overclocks, and this is because there is less differentiation between cards. The differentiation in clocks obviously is not there. So now you're left with coolers. And a lot of the market, probably not 90% of you, but you have to remember that outside of our bubble of enthusiast space, there's a much wider audience. And a lot of that market isn't going to look for things like thermals and noise. They will go to Newegg, they're going to click compare on 5 different products, and then look at the base and boost clocks and whatever other numbers are there, whether or not they understand them, and determine, okay, this one's got a higher number and it's this price, and so relative to the others, it's probably better for me. And that's completely a fine way to buy things. That's how everyone pretty much starts. But that plays into this because the 1070 Ti, all those numbers are going to be the same. So you're left with cooler and noise differences, which very few people test and even fewer people care about. So that's, from the board partner perspective, speaking with them, the lack of differentiation is kind of a big deal and will probably impact 1070 Ti sales. Another note from board partners, and sort of speaking with everyone, generally there was frustration over the pre-overclock lockdown by NVIDIA, but also generally the follow-up to that was, what are you going to do? You have no option. So you have to do what NVIDIA says if you're going to sell their product, and that's really the start and the end of it. The more expensive cooler designs now, speaking with the board partners, have less apparent value than they would otherwise, and they raise the cost of the final product in terms of the bill of materials without creating an obvious to consumer increase in performance. So most people, again, who don't think about thermals and noise, will see the extra $20, $30, whatever it is on top of MSRP, and it might not register as an actual advantage, because if that cooler isn't being leveraged to cool a pre-overclock better than something like a reference card could do, when you look at noise normalized thermal performance, then the benefit isn't realized. Not until the user either manually applies an overclock or purchases a card with downloadable software to do it for them. And again, the audience ultimately, even though we do cater to it, the audience that cares about things like manual overclocking is quite small. So that's definitely a big deal. This one is really not a surprise to anyone. So everyone we spoke with pretty much agreed that this move of the 1070 Ti is more to hamstring the Vega 56 sales than anything else. It's something that we talked about in our review. We talked about it before the review even came out, I think. It's not a surprise, because it's not a surprise that NVIDIA would compete with their competitor. So it's not a surprise then that NVIDIA would try to do something in response to Vega 56. I don't think anyone's questioning that. What's kind of weird is just the lockdowns on the pre-overclock. This is me speaking at this point, and it's really just hamstringing the partners more than anything. And if you think about it, of course, it's to create product segmentation. It's pretty normal, and that's not necessarily a good thing, but it's pretty normal. It's just that this type of product segmentation is new even for NVIDIA, who already have pretty limited overclocking utilities available to them comparatively. So it's a response to Vega 56, but also NVIDIA is trying not to fight their 1080 sales. And speaking again with the vendors, going back to what they were saying, so we asked everyone we spoke with, do you think the 1070 Ti or the 1080 will remain more popular? And because you look at them, going back to our review, the 1070 Ti, when overclocked particularly, does encroach on 1080 territory to the point where, with the exception of shader intensive games like Sniper, it really doesn't make a ton of sense to buy a 1080 if you're willing to overclock a 1070 Ti. Even an overclocked 1080, they're really not that different. They're a couple single-digit percentage points. So we asked, do you think the 1070 Ti will outsell your 1080? And most of them said that there's a couple different answers here, actually. We have 4 different sources, all with slightly different answers. So I'll just go through them sort of anonymized. One was the 1080 will still have its brand presence and recognition because the number 80 in NVIDIA series cards does carry a fair bit of weight. So from that perspective of a consumer looking from the outside of the enthusiast bubble in at product options, 1080 still sounds like the better option. And I guess technically it is, because there's no pre-overclocked 1070 Ti's. And technically in a lot of ways it is superior insofar as its objective performance. It's just a question of, is it superior in terms of price to performance and things like that when you account for overclocking. But so yes, one source did say the 1080 still carries enough sort of weight with its name that they didn't think the sales would be too heavily impacted. Another thought that the GTX 1070 would be actually 2 of them thought that the GTX 1070 would be the most affected product in the stack, where it'll move lower volume specifically because the 1070 Ti, just ignoring Vega from the equation. The 1070 Ti was thought of as stealing 1070 sales more than anything else. And then we also had the answer that it's going to depend on price, where 1070 Ti cards that are closer to $500 marks, and this is from a board partner, although it's kind of obvious, closer to $500, not a lot of point to buy them. You might as well buy a 1080. And I think everyone recognizes that. Board partners recognize that when asked what review samples we want from all the different manufacturers. Pretty much everyone agrees that things closer to $500 are not going to get as good of a review in terms of price to performance, because why would they? If you can spend $510 or $520 and get a 1080, which is, again, technically superior, then you should just buy that. But the thing is, the 1070 Ti does have a bit of an argument for it when it's less, significantly less, like $50, $70 less than a 1080. That's when it comes into play. So everyone's in agreement that the $500 cards are going to be a much harder sell. I think that goes through most of the board partner thoughts. I have some of my own. I have two or three more notes here that are quick. Generally sensing frustration with the board partners over the pre-overclock lockdown. Probably not surprising. It does sort of eat into what the board partners offer as a service for consumers. And then Everyone also basically agreed that there's nothing they can really do about it. You have to play by NVIDIA's rulebook because it's their GPU. So the best they can do is play tricks with software, game modes, one-click buttons, things like that. Oh, one other note. One of the partners we spoke with, this didn't affect everyone, but specifically one partner we spoke with did have to rename a product before coming to market with it pretty late in the cycle, allegedly. And the product rename was, I think, because they might have had the letters OC in the product name or some other synonym for overclocked. And that clearly doesn't affect everyone because you can look at the product stack and people still have pretty much the same names they've always had. But a couple companies apparently did have to consider renaming things because they weren't allowed to pre-overclock it. It makes sense. Why would you tack the letters OC onto it if it's not actually overclocked? So my thoughts on this. Opinions on the whole of the market. This goes beyond the 1070 Ti. This year, we had AMD Vega come out, and it's got a lock to be BIOS. You can flash Vega 64 signed BIOS onto 56, and you can't flash FE onto it. We tried that, didn't quite, well, can't flash FE onto it, at least with any changes. I haven't tried it since then. But once you start changing BIOS at all, even the name of the BIOS, it doesn't work. You can't flash custom BIOS onto there. So AMD instituted that change, and it was a big change, and in the overclocking community, it's not been well received. You have people like Bill Zoid, who I remember when I worked with him on it, he was just genuinely seemed, I'll use the phrase let down, because I don't want to speak for him, but it did seem like in the XOC community in general, it's like, okay, now we have to figure out an alternative. And even on our end, we're not XOCers or anything, but on our end, it comes down to how do we get around these limitations, and it's going to be things like power play tables and stuff like that, which work, but not as good of an option as a custom vBIOS. So AMD had that change, where they locked down parts of overclocking for a reason that seemed like it wasn't really an actual reason to do it. It was apparently for a secure boot thing, but that's not actually a requirement from what we understand. Now, as for NVIDIA, they're doing this their own way. They haven't instituted any overclocking restrictions on users for the 1070 Ti. It works the same as it always has. There's nothing special here. There are OC limitations on the board partners, so that's a bit different and new. And it's obviously for segmentation and to try and split the stack up so that the 1080 doesn't just completely die. The concerning point I would like people to pay attention to is that I'm a little worried that going forward with new GPU architectures and things, we may see similar practices with overclocking. And overclocking is a lot of fun. It can get you some more performance, sometimes a whole lot more performance. It doesn't need to be practical, and it generally isn't once you start going crazier with it. But that's not really the point either. The point is you've got the option, and it's fun to do, and a lot of you're buying these expensive video cards probably to have fun, whether that's playing a game or from the enthusiast aspect of building a computer and then tuning it and doing cool things and learning. That's kind of the whole point. So I am a little concerned about the trend from both AMD and NVIDIA, and hopefully we don't see a continued lockdown on overclocking. I would just ask that everyone kind of keep your eyes open and let us know if you see any further actions like this. But in the very least, the 1070 Ti is user overclockable, and we got it quite far, actually. We made it easily outperform a 1080 and basically matches an overclocked 1080, depending on Silicon Lottery. But yeah, I don't know. It's a very Apple-like play from both of them. It's an Apple-like play to lock vBIOS. This is old news now. We've talked about it already. It's definitely an Apple-like play to put restrictions on manufacturers to the point where it's kind of like, what's your end game here, NVIDIA? Like, is it going to be focusing more on Founders Edition cards with different cooler designs in the future? Because this, if they're all going to be the same reference and base and boost clocks, the only reason not to buy this is the cooler. So at some point you would start wondering, is NVIDIA going to try and compete with its partners more directly? But that's all just really speculation at this point, and more stuff to keep an eye on than anything else. But yeah, that's front half thoughts from the manufacturers about 1070 Ti, back half just an extension of our review. As far as performance, just kind of revisit this very briefly. If you want the performance metrics, check the review. But very briefly, the 1070 Ti is in a position once again where it handily outperforms the 1070, generally outperforms Vega 56, depends on the title, and can be made to outperform a 1080 or perform equally with an overclocked 1080. All of this in mind, depending on the price, it might be a better buy than the 1080 at this point. So again, we go back to the point I was making in the review of, is it the 1080 that doesn't make sense or the 1070 Ti that doesn't make sense? One of them loses market share here. It's just a question of which one is it. And as close to $450 as possible, the 1070 Ti seems like it's potentially a good product to work with if you're going to overclock it. The minute you start increasing the price, $10, $20, $30, at that point, especially $30, it is sort of looking like you should just buy a 1080. Now, the big question here that we didn't discuss in the review is, well, you know, it sounds like there's not a lot of room between the prices. We talked about that. But why couldn't NVIDIA just drop the price of the 1080 down to functionally 1070 Ti prices, even $470 or something like that? And technically speaking, the 1080 has been available for around that price in the past. It was before the mining craze that ruined all GPU prices, but it was available around that price. So I think that's why the 1070 Ti feels a little bit, it seems like it's gotten a pretty negative reaction from the community in general. You look at all the comments and they're mostly like, why does this card need to exist? And it's a fair point, because the 1080 could have been dropped in price, and that would be crazy competitive. But I think, looking at it sort of from NVIDIA's perspective, where your goal is to compete with AMD on V56 and beat them, which the 1080 could do in terms of performance, but maybe not as much price, though they could try. I think from their perspective, it's less about let's get a card into this price bracket to compete with Vega 56, and more about let's get a card that gets visibility, and we talked about this in the review, and change the discussion so that when people are talking about what card do I buy between $350 and $450, or $500, let's say, make it a big range, it changes the discussion so that now, instead of Vega 56 versus 1070, it's 1070 Ti versus 1080, or 1070 Ti versus 1070. And Vega 56 is in there a little bit, but the fact that it's got two long-standing, heavily reviewed products, and then one brand new one that just breached the product cycle and is making a lot of rounds on everywhere. I think having those three cards flanking Vega 56 takes away some of the spotlight from it, and that's further expanded by the lack of Vega 56 partner cards, even 64, but we're just looking at 56 today. The lack of partner cards and general limited supply, although prices have come down at least temporarily to around MSRP, lack of the supply and partner cards doesn't really help. It's got no backup. The reference card is just out there solo against now a huge wave of 1070 Ti's that obviously get coverage, and they should, but a huge wave of that, and then 1080s are now being discussed once again for the first time in like 6 months. So I think it was a strategic play. I've just had more time to think about it now and talk to manufacturers, so it was worth revisiting once again as an addendum to the review. But yeah, I don't know. You can watch the review if you want to know which card to buy. We have the numbers there for you. I don't really make a firm statement on a global scale of what I think you should buy, but I have a few statements in the review of when card A makes more sense than card B in certain conditions. So hopefully that helps you. As for Vega, whether or not those prices stay, and I don't suspect that they will, they are low right now. So if you can find Vega, if you've wanted Vega 56 for a long time now, you better buy it probably soon, because I think after this wave of 1070 Ti cards starts losing coverage and just sort of falling back in the cycle, I think Vega 56 will at least go back up a little bit in price, because there's some incentive there for it to be cheaper right now. But either way, it's still a reference card. The reference card from both NVIDIA and AMD, they both suck, and we've been clear on that for years now. So if you want to buy it, be aware of that and consider like a Morpheus or a hybrid mod. We have a guide where we did a hybrid mod. Do something like that with it, and you'll be in pretty good shape. But as for the 1070, 1070 Ti, and 1080, we've got plenty of coverage on those. Check the review. That's all for this one. You can subscribe for more, or go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. Gamersnexus.net for the written review, which does have the first half of the written review has some thoughts that weren't fully in the video. A good bit of it was, but not all of it. And then the conclusion has some expansion on that. So if you want more thoughts on this still, check the review out, gamersnexus.net. Again, subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.